So thanks everyone for being here. This is an informal roundtable discussion on the California PUC's net metering 3.0 proposed decision.
Okay, yeah.
I'm Jim Lazar. I'm one of the creators of the Electricity Brain Trust, which is just an email list of 600 plus electricity experts around the world. We don't have an organization. We don't have a position on anything. Our goal is to provide a virtual Switzerland where people with widely different points of view can get together. Just the format for how this is going to work, I'm going to ask everybody who's not speaking to turn off your cameras and mute yourself. I've already muted one person who was interrupting. If you want to speak, turn on your camera and raise your hand. And the raise hand button is at the bottom of your screen, often inside reactions. And that combination will make you show up on my screen. The panel gets to respond to everybody. Others more or less wait to be called on. I've got just a couple of opening slides, and we're going to then hear from Ed Smeloff from who was with Vote Solar until Friday and involved with the solar parties in this docket. Mohit Chhabra at NRDC, a party and involved with the joint parties, including the public advocate in turn. John Wilson, who was an expert for the small business advocate and was not aligned with the various teams. I invited the IOUs. I got a we decline message from PGE, although if there's some folks here from the IOUs who want to join the discussion, that's fine. First, a little bit of California regulatory thing. What is a proposed decision? Not many states use these. It is a draft decision put together by what's called the assigned commissioner and the administrative law judge. The assigned commissioner is the person of the 5 commissioners assigned to bird dog this docket. It is then subject to exceptions that are filed by the parties. Sometimes a second alternative proposed decision is issued by a different commissioner. And then all of the commissioners consider the proposed decision, the exceptions, and any alternate decisions. I'll just note that in the NEM 2.0 case 8 years ago, transmission was treated as not avoidable in the proposed decision and was moved into the avoidable category in the final decision, which increased the backfeed rate by about 3 cents a kilowatt hour. What solar customers get when they feed power back to the grid. The key elements of this proposal, I've put together a little table of the NEM 1.0 with all the no fixed charges and backfeed at the retail rate. NEM 2.0, no same fixed charges as other customers, backfeed at about 3 cents less than the retail rate, and the NEM 3.0 proposed decision.
Hey, David. Hey, thanks very much for calling me back. I appreciate it.
And you can ask people to mute themselves. An $8 a kW per month fixed charge, that's 32 to 60 bucks a month for a residential solar customer. In the early years, a transition credit of about half of that for PG&E customers. Backfeed dramatically reduced from based on the retail rate to based on wholesale market prices. And then that customers would be on this before transferred to a different rate design, only given a 15-year guarantee compared to what was promised as 20 in NEM 2.0. Finally, there's some political issues here. The assigned commissioner is departing the commission to head the regional EPA office appointed by the Biden administration. The chair's term expires at the end of this year, so the governor's going to have 2 new appointees. And we will, I think, through those new appointees, find out whether the governor supports this pathway or wants some other pathway. With that, I'm going to ask Mohit to take a few minutes, followed by Ed and Ed Smeloff and John Wilson.
Thank you, Jim. Thanks for the introduction and thanks for having me. I don't know many of you, but I've read a lot of your names before, having learned a lot on the energy sector, reading your publications. So I'll start by stating the problem statement, how the PUC went about and where they landed, and generally why I agree with where they landed. So the solar weighted avoided costs currently are around 5 to 6 cents a kilowatt hour. And this includes a robust value of carbon and a value to get to our clean energy goals. So they're, have some aspects of societal benefits built into them. The volumetric charges, depending on the different IOUs and depending on time, are between 4 to 7 times that in California. So NEM credits at retail rate are overvalued. And this generally isn't a big deal when penetration of solar is small within a rate class, within a customer class segment. In the most extreme case in San Diego, more than 15% of the residential load is on solar. So put together, this can have some pretty real and undue rate impacts. The public advocates, ratepayer advocates, and IOUs separately estimated this difference between valuing solar production at avoided costs versus retail rate to be around $3 billion. And from what my scrutiny of those spreadsheets say, they're more or less about right. And 3 separate parties, NRDC, the ratepayer advocates, and Professor Bornstein from Haas, estimated that 15 to 17% of San Diego's residential rate is due to just this portion of overpayment of NEM. So, one problem is that electricity consumption charges are fast getting more expensive than gasoline and natural gas, and that's something to be careful about. And to be fair, there are lots of reasons why rates are high and we need to work on all of them. The PUC opened a proceeding for NEM, so we're working on NEM right now. Compounding is this issue is the fact that there's no surprise that PV installations skew much wealthier than the population. So when you put sort of that difference between avoided costs, valuing PV production at avoided costs versus retail rates, and the demographic that has this installed, you get a pretty regressive flow of money. That's substantial. So the California has a mandate to keep distributed generation growing sustainably per law. What that means is up to the PUC to determine. The PUC also has mandates of minimizing rate impacts and basing net metering on costs and benefits to all customers. If you were to, for example, value all PV output at just the avoided costs, then the payback for a residential solar system, order of magnitude, would be around 25 years. So what the commission is trying to do here is to come up with a tariff that gets a 10-year payback. And it's imperative that they get their assumptions right to get that 10-year payback, to balance keeping solar a viable product along with the rate impacts of net metering. And even with this proposal, you do see that NEM earnings are 3-ish times on average the benefits, if you value them at avoided costs, that residential rooftop solar provides. And when running through these numbers, because volumetric charges are so high, it's impossible to get anything close to that 10-year payback without having some sort of grid participation charge for solar customers. So that's where it comes in. And back calculating what a grid participation charge would be if you were to value all solar output at avoided cost, just as an intellectual exercise, you get a value of around $14 to $15. So, just to put those $8 per kW in context. And that's required for the T&D portion of the charges that's recovered through volumetric rates. And also, we have a lot of non-bypassable charges in our rates now in California. I'll say that ideally we'd fix rate design first comprehensively and then figure out what happens to NEM. This really is a issue with rate design that wasn't designed for a two-way flow, but we didn't have that freedom. The proceeding opened and we have to do our best here, living in an imperfect world. On Jim's last question about the politics and how they might impact things, last time during NEM 2.0, I wasn't at NRDC or involved with this then. So a lot of my understanding is based on history and watching the commission decisions. The judge decided something that included having some transmission charges for NEM customers. And there was a lot of public pressure on the PUC, lots of politics above my pay grade, and last minute things were changed. Is something like that going to happen now? No one knows. As for an analyst's sanity, you got to separate this into a judge's decision and then what happens later after policy and politics combine. So I'll pause there. Thank you.
All right. Ed Smeloff worked with both solar during this docket, and I asked him to kind of give us a solar party perspective.
Thank you, Jim. I'm still with Vote Solar for another 2 weeks before I retire from the organization. I was not deeply involved in the proceeding. There were others at Vote Solar that were involved, but I have read the proposed decision, and let me offer some comments. Well, first of all, I don't disagree with Mohit that NEM needed to be reformed, that retail rates were out of alignment with what was a just and reasonable compensation for exported power from behind the meter resources. However, what has come out in this proposed decision, in my opinion, is an abomination, and it's antithetical to every principle that NRDC used to adhere to, which is to oppose high customer service charges, to support minimum bill charges, to support time of use rates. And instead, what we're getting in this decision is this non-bypassable so-called grid participation charge. And I will read to you the logic that goes behind this euphemism of a grid participation charge in a few seconds. But let me start by saying, where are some areas of agreement that I have? So the commission did adopt policies that should guide the NEM decision. And I think Mohit and I probably would agree on these four basic policies that tried to be the overview. First, the successor tariff should include a glide path. This is gradualism. This is something that goes back to bond right, to enable a transition to work where you maintain a healthy and robust solar industry. So a glide path is an essential feature. It's not also as part of the legislation, AB 3327, which is what structures this restructuring of NEM, requires that there be sustainable growth within the solar industry. Second, the new tariff should support equity and inclusion. Vote Solar strongly supports that. We do agree with the conclusion that the current rate structure has not lifted up and benefited low-income and disadvantaged community customers. And a new tariff specifically and intentionally needs to do that. And there are some good features in this proposed decision that does focus on disadvantaged communities and low-income customers. Third, the successor tariff should promote electrification. I don't think anybody would disagree with that. I think a key element of promoting electrification is providing a lot of flexibility within the system, but based on a rate structure where the cost of service is reflected in the rates that are being charged based on differentiation between different periods of the day, different time of use. And another good feature of this decision is it does say that NEM customers will move to a highly differentiated time of use tariff, starting with the electric vehicle tariffs that are already in place for the 3 investor-owned utilities. But I think they need to go further, and they anticipate going further so that we really move the rate structure. And the rate structure is fundamental. You can't disassociate or decouple NEM policy from the underlying rate structure. They go hand in hand. So we do need a rate structure that focuses on what are the peak requirements, net peak requirements in California, which are driving future costs. And so we should be using our investments in solar and solar plus storage to offset the increasing costs that occurred during the peak, the gross peak and the net peak periods. Then lastly, and this is a really important one, and I think for both solar, sort of the most fundamental of the policies, and that is the successor tariff should promote or should transition the solar market to a market that is based on solar paired with storage. It's clear, wherever you look across the spectrum of solar technology, solar paired with storage is a net multiplier. It's more than just the sum of the parts. It provides a lot of flexibility, whether it's with it interconnected at the transmission level, whether it's in front of the meter, solar plus storage, or behind the meter, solar plus storage. So that's where we want to go, because solar plus storage can provide reliability services. It can be flexible, it's adaptable. Unfortunately, this proposal doesn't do that. It really does fail on promoting solar plus storage. There is a storage evolution charge, which is a good start, and there is a minimum level of funding for coupling storage for existing solar customers if they transition to the new NEM rate. But it's not adequate. And it doesn't really focus on providing a higher incentive for disadvantaged communities and low-income customers. Let me pivot back to this abomination, I called it, which is called a grid participation charge. And let me just read you one paragraph. I'm only going to read one paragraph from the decision, and really establishes a grid participation charge. As part of the rate structure, we adopted a grid participation charge to enable the Commission to create a successor tariff that ensures equity among customers and is accurately based on costs and benefits of the generator.
Garbled.
Can you hear me?
Better.
We find the name grid participation charge sends a clear message to the customer that they are paying to use the grid. A clear message to the customer that they are paying to use the grid. Well, okay, the charge will be a fixed monthly charge based on the number of kilowatts installed in the residential customer system. Because the non-residential customers already have fixed and demand charges included in rates, we find it reasonable to only apply the grid participation charge to residential customers. Well, it is absurd on the face of it. Anyone would say everybody participates with the grid. If you have a programmable hot water heater, you participate with the grid. If you have a smart thermostat, you participate with the grid. But none of these other technologies get a grid participation charge. And commercial and industrial customers don't get a grid participation charge. That's because they already pay a demand charge. So there's a better way. And I would hope Mohit and NRDC join with both solar and others to kind of get rid of this grid participation charge, which is non-bypassable, is anti-consumer. You can't change your bill by changing your behavior, and move it to something that really does encourage behavioral change. Time of use rates, highly differentiated time of use rates with critical peak pricing, or even an alternative where the residential customer could choose to go on a demand charge rate where they can actually, it's a little more difficult, but they can actually change their behavior and use artificial intelligence or program their appliances to avoid a demand charge. That's what we want to see in a successor tariff, is something that encourages innovation, encourages pairing of solar with batteries, encourages electrification, where all of the resources work together as a suite of technologies. Unfortunately, this is sort of a way of burning down the village and then trying to rebuild it. This is going to be a devastating blow, this grid participation charge to the industry, coupled, and we'll get into more detail a little bit later.
Yeah, I want to get on to John here pretty quick.
The quick step. Just one last closing comment, Jim. And so we're making this big step down using the avoided cost calculator to change what the export compensation is. I'll just say the avoided cost calculator theoretically is the right way to go, but it's still a work in progress, and it's volatile and inconsistent and has produced inconsistent results. And it shouldn't be relied on as a precise instrument. It should be relied on as something that gives us indicative. So I'll end it there, Jim, and turn it back over to you.
Thanks. I'm going to give it to John, and then after John, we'll open it up for everybody. And I'll ask you again to keep your cameras turned off. I've turned off a bunch of them. And if you want to speak, both raise your hand using the raise hand function and turn on your camera once John is done. John?
Thanks, Jim. So I'm with Resource Insight, and my colleague Paul Chernick and I filed testimony on behalf of small business utility advocates. I would say we are sort of in the muddled middle. We are right. We managed to pick the spot on the road that was right on the two yellow stripes right down the middle of the road. And so we were left out of both coalitions, I think. We did agree reluctantly to support the grid participation charge, but I think we also agree with a lot of the points that Ed just made regarding the scale of the devastation that this is likely to have on solar. And that's going to hurt customers in California, I think, in the long run, because the state is not prepared to, it's already prepared to do a massive escalation of solar and battery storage and so forth at the utility scale. And this decision, if it goes through, is only going to exacerbate that or increase that scale that is required. And it's really very questionable whether that's possible. And I think the decision is a real mess because it doesn't even engage that question. There's not even a paragraph or a section that talks about how California will adjust its planning process to respond to the lack of solar, rooftop solar that will be developed. So that's a big concern. Let me talk through just a few, we've had some high level comments here. I'm going to just give everyone a little bit of a flavor for some of the, sort of detail level problems in this decision. And I'm just going to pick out 4 things really quick. One is the market transition charge. And one thing I'm just going to point out is that, our clients are commercial, so we're very happy that they were exempted from we're very disappointed that they were exempted from the market transition credit. And there's literally no explanation why. The entire section on the market transition credit lacks the word non-residential. It only appears in the table where it says 0. So this is kind of a problem. The second thing I'll talk about is the grid participation charge design. We did reluctantly support this, but it's like the explanation for it is terrible. Why is it $8 an hour? Is it cost-based? No, it is not. The $8 per hour is basically said, look at what the public advocate's office put forward and round it up to $8 for everybody because that's nice and simple. But when you look at what they actually use to calculate the grid participation charge in the public advocate's office testimony, it was based on the assumption, it completely ignored storage. There's no consideration of storage in it. It completely relies on rates that are prohibited by the order. So the calculation of this cost-based rate supposedly is based on rates that will not be part of a NEM 3.0 program. So that's a big problem, I think, in that there's no way to reproduce the method in any intelligent way going forward in rate cases. And in fact, it's not even planned to be in rate cases. It's planned to be in this 5-year evaluation report, and they might reconsider this $8 flat charge. So California makes a huge deal about cost-based rates. If you go into a rate case, there is so much detail on making these rates cost-based compared to other states that I work in. And yet in this case, it's just like, up, $8. So that's a big problem. And then the fact that it doesn't consider storage means that that storage customers who are shifting their load from peak period, from low demand periods of the day to high demand periods of the day, are still charged as if they're generating power in the low demand period of the day. So there's this whole problem with, you're saying we want a resource that produces during the evening peak, but yet the charge is based on as if you're producing during the noon net load. Final point I'll make here is on the payback period. There's this citation of a 10-year payback period that continually gets reproduced. That's going to mean a 75% cut in solar production based on our analysis. There's no discussion in there about the fact that that's going to be even harder for non-residential customers to deal with because they do not respond to that payback period. And the evidence that they cite for the 10-year payback period is basically a 2013 study from NREL that just says, that literally says the portion of the eligible market base willing to adopt solar drops precipitously as the cost recovery period moves from 5 to 10 years. That's the only place they mention the word 10 years in that section of the proposed decision as evidence. So there's no basis for this 10-year number. So those are just 3 examples. I could go on and give you a bunch more, but this decision is just not well aligned between the conclusions and the evidence. And that's because it's such a complicated matter. I do not envy the administrative law judge's challenge in dealing with this evidence, but it really was too much to bite off in a single order. And I really think it should have been broken up into a couple of percent.
Thanks a lot, John.
Yeah, thank you, Jim.
We're going to go on to open mic here now. I first want to see if Ahmed Faruqi, the co-founder of the Electricity Brain Trust, is on the phone. I know he's got something at 1:30, and I wanted to give him a minute if he is on the phone. Are you out there, Ahmed? All right, so if you want to say something or ask something, we've got one question in the chat already for Ed. Do you agree with Mohit's characterization of the gap between the avoided cost and the retail tariff? Anyway, if you want to ask a question or say something, turn on your camera and raise your hand, and then I'll know that you want to be recognized.
So the question is, do I agree with a gap between compensation at retail prices versus some different valuation of what the compensation should be? Well, of course I do. It's really a balancing of a number of issues to achieve the policies that the state of California wants to achieve. And I think a key one that I'll just reiterate is the move to get existing solar customers to also add storage. Storage is still fairly costly. I looked at it myself for my PV system. And there does need to be an incentive. It has to be a bigger incentive for low-income customers, greater than right now. It's proposed at 20 cents a watt hour for the rated capacity of the battery system. So if you look at the self-generation incentive program, they have a number of incentives, that's tiered to different levels of need and where you are. If you're in a high fire zone, you get a higher rebate. We should take a look at the self-generation incentive program and use it for this, but also, as they did in Hawaii, and as Jim might remember, in Hawaii, when they put together their battery incentive program, they put performance requirements on that so that those batteries that are getting an incentive from other customers are actually having to be used at the time of the day when the net peak occurs, and provides reliability services and actually fills a gap in Hawaii as the large coal plant closes on Oahu. We should be thinking through these things in a more cohesive, coherent way so that we make this transition to solar plus storage happen quickly.
So the first hand I see up is Pentti Alto, and I'm going to ask Pentti to unmute himself. Go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah. I guess first, there are a whole number of things that I get to here. First, the concept of avoided cost. If I turn out the lights and save a kilowatt hour, what did I avoid? I avoided the generator, nothing else. Yet I get a full credit for all of my retail value. Is that fair? Did that load up anything on anyone else? I don't think so. other than the utility lost revenue and the generator lost revenue. If I generate a kilowatt hour, what happens? Exactly the same thing. If I generate a kilowatt hour and export it, my downstream neighbor uses it, pays the utility and the generator for services they didn't provide. 100% of the retail value for services they didn't provide. There's no transfer of cost. There's no added cost. So then the question is, well, what's the problem? Well, the problem is the utility lost revenue, the generator lost revenue. Now in New England, where I am, our generators are generally competitive players. They expect to lose revenue if they don't sell something. Our utilities seem to think that they should get paid even if they don't provide service.
Betsy, I think you've actually raised a very important issue, kind of sideways, which is in New England, the power comes from competitive generators, and customers, when they subscribe to power, pay that competitive generator an all-in price for power that includes whatever costs are there, whether they're fixed costs, investment costs, depreciation expenses, fuel costs, purchase power, because it all gets rolled into one.
Yeah, hedging is probably the biggest piece of it.
Yeah.
And
they do hedge. And in California, this avoided cost calculator does not treat the investment related or depreciation expense type costs as part of the avoided cost, as I understand it. Mohit, let me ask you to respond to my concern about the difference between the East Coast and the California treatment of what's avoidable.
Well, I don't completely understand the question, mostly because at least in California context, short term, the utilities are a conduit between the generators and the customer, right? Like they just pass on the total cost. So if a generator, they purchase less from the generator, they pass on less to the customer. So when you say, so what's the question?
Well, the question is in New England, when a customer doesn't consume a kilowatt hour, whether because they're solar or otherwise, or they backfeed a kilowatt hour, they get credited at an all-in generation rate, not at an avoided cost rate.
Question is, in my understanding, for say small conservation measures where customers save some energy, they will save energy at the retail rate still. But in this PV case, we've introduced the concept of paying customers at avoided costs and such, and why the difference? Is that your question?
Perhaps I might interject a little bit. In New England, each of the states has its own rules and different ways of proceeding. Our wholesale costs, essentially the only thing that I avoid by turning out my lights is the fuel and marginal operating costs for the facility. Yet I get full value for turning out my lights. And the only difference between turning out my lights and generating a kilowatt hour to the utility is non-detectable, because the effect on the grid and everything else is exactly the same. If it's fair for me to get full value for saving a kilowatt hour, why not full value for the kilowatt hour I generate, which is paid for fully by my downstream neighbor for those services the utility did not provide and the generator did not provide.
Jim, maybe I can provide a little bit of clarity here. So the avoided cost calculator is based on the long-term marginal costs in California. As an input to the avoided cost calculator, we do an integrated resource planning process, which is comprehensive in California and looks at the entire grid rather than utility by utility. And we use a capacity expansion model called Resolve to come up with a portfolio of resources. We look at 2030, it has to meet certain greenhouse gas reductions. Then we run that portfolio through a production cost model. The commission has developed a new one with the Strape called SERVM. And this is where things start to fall apart within the avoided cost calculator, is that we have a new uncalibrated production cost model, which is the input to the hourly avoided cost, long-term avoided marginal cost in the avoided cost calculator. And it's produced different results in the last 2 years, significantly different results. And we know from the integrated resource planning process that SERVM, the production cost model, doesn't align with other production cost models like the one used by the CAISO or Southern California Edison, Plexos. So we really do have a calibration problem. We're trying to make very precise decisions about what the compensation is based on something that has not been fixed. It's really, I mean, one can say 2021's results are better than 2020, but on what basis? If you had two instruments and they produced 70% difference in the measurements, you would say, we got a margin of error problem here with the instrument. We need to do a better job before we use it to measure things. So that's sort of the fundamental problem, is it's just false precision that we're doing, and that kind of ripples out, and it affects this glide path and transition in a way that's just devastating to the solar industry.
So Ed, I have a friendly amendment there. I think those are some really important concepts to get straight though. So in the 2020 avoided cost calculator produced very different results than what we've seen before, 2017, 18, 19, and what we've seen after. And that was an issue of no calibration or incorrect calibration of the production cost model to ISO. The way that was corrected was with calibration, right? And I'm with you that the 2020 avoided cost calculator that had very different results, and it's really hard to get precise on these things, but from an order of magnitude, that calculator was producing some really far out there results, and that was the lone sort of out there calculator. So yes, it's an instrument that's produced slightly different results, but there was one clear outlier here. And yeah, I mean, we can go back and forth on this, and I can show you evidence on why that wasn't right. It was basically saying,
Mohit Chhabra, he's in San Francisco.
It was basically saying that every year going forward, there will be more and more marginal generation and emissions in the middle of the day, and valuing that at higher prices for emissions and otherwise. And that was the genesis of the difference. And that's what was corrected. So I'm with you that it's a really complex tool, and we need to be very careful when we apply it and not take false precision. But at the same time, an error was made, and the commission corrected it. And I'll be frank, I helped point out the error and said, hey, you need to correct this.
So, you know, while the 2020 may have had an error in it, the correction was to use output from SERVM, a production cost model, which itself has not been vetted and which is a black box, which didn't go through any scrutiny. So it's just,
they calibrated 2020 CAISO prices to SERVM output before pushing it forward that time. That's what I mean. It's not right to say it wasn't uncalibrated, but it's not fully calibrated either.
Calibrating to 1 year's CAISO short-term marginal cost is not the right way to look at long-term marginal cost. It's not correct. And you know, all I'm saying is, be careful. Recognize that the results likely are incorrect and will be corrected again, and we should put in a whatever margin of error, you know,
right. No, I agree with you in principle. Everything you're saying is right. The only thing that I've heard this so much is there was an error, but to point at that and say the tool's useless. You know, so there's a lot of space in between, and I know you're not saying that, but that's what we hear.
I'm saying
a lot of space.
We need to have a tool that we have confidence in.
Yeah.
To move to a tool, the avoided cost calculator is the right concept. We want marginal cost.
Right.
But
I want to go on to a question I know is coming from Myron Katz in Louisiana, And remind people, if you want to pose a question or make a comment, turn on your camera and raise your hand. That combination moves you up to the top of my screen. Byron.
Okay, well, I can't turn on my camera, but I don't mind. I'll talk with my camera off. So when we heard the definition of this participation cost, okay, I turn on my video. Okay, so the participation cost was there a background noise I'm causing? Okay, it was $8 per kilowatt month. Okay, based on PV size. So it reminds me of what I think is sort of the average demand charge for the country for commercial customers of around $10 per kilowatt a month, which I understand, unless I'm grossly misread the paper by Chernick and Lazar, that such flat demand charges are regressive. And in the rate design that I propose, instead of putting all that demand charge flat across the whole year, why not concentrate it during the near peak demand times, which in my rate design is about 500 hours a year, are all concentrated into the summer months. And this turns into around a 50 cents per kilowatt hour charge, which is equivalent to, if you pay in reverse, a 50 cents per kilowatt hour payment for solar, which I think is all cost-based, because if you believe that that charge is appropriately calculated, sort of paraphrasing what Ed Smeloff said, is something like the averaged out capacity charge or something.
So Myron, I will agree with you that a high peak period charge is a better way to recover fixed costs than a grid participation charge, which is not avoidable. It's not even like a demand charge, which is avoidable if you change the amount of peak demand. The grid participation charge.
I fell out while I was talking. Just let me finish saying that whatever you say, this is a charge that winds up being a payment for solar power at around 50 cents per kilowatt hour. And it's also a negative, it's demand charge, which discourages demand during the near peak demand times. It's not regressive. It doesn't shift costs to the people who are not actively doing it. And it pays for solar power. We found it more than makes up for the net metering charges that we see in New Orleans. So people actually get paid with this rate design higher than net metering. And we found, as far as we could calculate, no cross subsidies.
So, Myron, one of the reasons that things are a little different in California is that there is already a heavy time of use rate structure there that provides a lot of that time component to the rates. And Paul Chernick and I very reluctantly came to the conclusion that some kind of a grid participation charge was warranted in California. But it was mainly because there was a cost basis for it. There's a study by PG&E that actually looked at the cost to serve solar customers versus non-solar customers. They didn't look at solar plus storage, and there was a higher cost to serve the non-solar customers. So we think looking at that cost increment, that bit that's a little bit of a higher cost of service, it is appropriate to allocate that cost back to the customers. What we think that the decision got wrong was this more broad approach to basically trying to throw all of these costs that are sort of based on this idea that there's this rate ideal that's out there that was set with rates that were in effect back in 2017 or 2018, and we're going to then make sure we make up that full gap between that rate and the future rates with this grid participation charge. And we think it's an overcharge. So we think that a cost-based rate that actually has a foundation in a real study makes sense, and that just wasn't done here with this grid participation charge design. And so that's a big problem with the decision.
I've got a question for you, John, which is, was the small business advocates' principal concern in this docket the rising costs of service to those customers that did not have solar, or ensuring that the small business customers that did install solar would get adequate compensation? What was, I mean, the small business advocate is quite an oddball party.
Yeah, it is. And actually, if you just take out the word or and you put in and, you're quoting our testimony, because we actually had both of those concerns and we were constantly trying to balance them because our customers have basically been left out of the past 10 years, almost not at all participating in solar NEM, paying these rates. And yet, many of them would like to have solar plus storage systems, not only because, it's a good deal, but because it provides them with resilience, which is really important if you're a small medical office or you're involved in some other critical service. Given all of the power outages, particularly in areas that are affected by wildfires, having that kind of backup service would be a real asset to them. And the value of resilience to small businesses is actually much higher than it is to residential customers. But they couldn't get that from a solar system because it's going to get turned off whenever the grid is turned off. So a system that was really designed around solar plus storage, truly, and as Ed points out, this one is not, would be one that would benefit small business customers. And that was sort of the slot down the middle that we were trying to aim for with our proposal. I'm thinking we probably didn't reach too many people, but we tried.
All right, just a reminder to folks, if you want to pose a question or say something, turn on your camera and raise your hand.
John's point about resilience is a really important one. Resilience is still a difficult concept to quantify. It wasn't quantified in this proceeding. There is going to be a value of resilience portion of the microgrid proceeding where they're going to look at the possibility of a resilience standard for the utilities, because there are a lot of circuits, particularly in PG&E, where the level of service is pretty bad. And, and some of it's exogenous with the wildfires and all, but we really do need to hold the utilities to a resilience standard, and then to make the kinds of investments like John is suggesting, where we're making individual customers or critical load customers more resilient. There's a public benefit there.
Yeah, at a minimum, the storage should basically be used to offset the grid participation charge. That was what we proposed, is that if you have a grid participation charge, it should essentially be zero, and it's kind of complicated how to measure that, but it should be zero for customers with storage. And with that kind of a system in place, then you begin to incentivize this resilience. And that's completely consistent. Ed just mentioned the microgrid proceeding, where they just exempted microgrid systems from paying a standby charge. And a standby charge is very similar to the concept of this grid participation charge. So if you make it cost-based, if you think about really how solar and storage perform on a feeder system, which is where all of these are, they're not on individual connections to transmission, then you can begin to really design this properly.
I'd like to add one point here. I think sort of the way John described what the commission's trying to do with the grid participation chart is right. They're trying to back out, trying to make, in a volumetric rate world, what's the best way to recover some transmission and distribution based charges and non-bypassable charges from customers that in NEM 2.0 just weren't contributing. And I'd add that no matter what method the commission would have chosen, there would have been a lot of pros and cons, because there's just no perfect way to do it when your basis is volumetric rates where they're just not cost reflective anymore.
Well, why would you limit it to just solar customers then? Why does a customer who installs a smart thermostat exempt from a grid participation charge? Because they're going to create so-called lost revenues as well. So it's a slippery slope you're going down with this.
Yeah, and we thought really hard about that. And the reason why we ended up saying that those two customers can be treated differently, and I'll use energy efficiency as a whole, is there were four main reasons. The first was maybe three, because three come to mind right now. The first was, there's a pretty stark difference between solar customers and non-solar customers. It's really hard to draw the line for energy efficiency customers, given that a lot of our energy efficiency money in California is going to codes and standards, market transformation program that benefit large swaths of customers, right? So it's really hard to tell who's shifting on whom and how many are left out from it. It's just, especially when whole markets are transformed for, say, residential lighting, it's just really hard to tell that practically. and it's quite small, the kW that they save as well, right? So there's that. And then finally, it was a big deal, at least for us, especially for me, that to the extent possible, and I know it's hard to keep things progressive. And currently in EE, and we've worked on this a lot, we spend more money on low income and equity programs than non-low income programs right now.
Well,
So
that's a positive, but I mean,
Yeah.
there is $600 million now that is targeted to low income solar, and that's the right thing.
Right.
We agree with that. That is a very positive thing. The details still to be worked
Mhm.
out, but there's going to be a lot of distortions that are caused by this grid participation charge for
And-
new homes and low income homes. I just think it hasn't been thought through.
Right, we need to, and this was clearly the hardest part of this package, right? And the question comes down to what's causing more distortions until you can do a whole cloth rate reform? Is it the existing system with NEM where volumetric charges are going higher and higher, more and more customers are choosing to go on it, more and more costs for the grid are being thrown on to poor people, or something like this, which is, as you point out rightfully, imperfect, but for the time being, until we can make a whole cloth rate reform. And yeah, we landed on that second part because on net, it seemed to cause less distortions.
But who's
Let me
going to
pose it.
who's going to
Put it right here, Ed. Because I want you to respond first to what I'm gonna pose. Markets don't tolerate fixed charges for very long. People find ways around them. And arguably one of the functions of regulation is the main function of regulation is to impose on monopolies the pricing discipline that markets enforce under competition. And Home Depot doesn't charge me extra just because I have some of my own tools and don't need to have them do everything. And Macy's doesn't charge me extra because I have a sewing machine. And Supermarket doesn't charge me extra because I have a tomato garden. What we saw in Hawaii when the first draconian restriction came into place is that hundreds, and it looked like soon thousands of customers would move to off-grid systems. And in California, the way that one would do that would be to connect an off-grid system, a non-integrated system, so you're not getting an interconnection permit, and you're not classified as a solar customer, and run most of your house off of that, and have a utility meter that perhaps ran your fridge and freezer and some essential circuits, and periodically plug your battery bank into the grid meter to charge them up if it had been not sunny for a while. And you could avoid all of these charges and gain the benefits of a solar plus storage system for yourself, avoiding the retail price for all of the electricity that you don't take from the grid, waiving any credit because you're not going to send power back to the grid. And then you wind up with a grid that doesn't have access to hundreds or thousands or tens of thousands or millions of customer batteries. And I'm going to ask you, what is the prospect of the solar industry moving into what they've done in Hawaii, installing off-grid systems with manual transfer switches to get around this? I'll ask the others to respond to that, and then we'll wrap this up at the top of the hour.
Jim, I think it's simpler than the process that you described. There's no requirement in California that you be on the NEM tariff to install a solar system on your premise. There are a number of customers, mostly commercial and industrial customers, that do that. The requirement is that you not export. You still have a right to interconnect. You still have to follow Rule 21. So if you put on a protective relay or something, I don't see any reason why you could not install a solar system. You probably want to do solar and storage, but you could install a solar system on your house and simply say, I'm not paying the grid participation charge. I'm not exporting. I don't expect to get paid for exporting. If I inadvertently export, it's for free. I'm not going to charge the utility. That does seem like a business model that somebody out there is going to think about, that's smarter than me, or at least is more engaged in the market than I am. I do think rules get bypassed. These kind of fixed charges where there's very little benefit for the customer, people are going to figure out ways to avoid them. And it's it's going to be a kludge. It's going to be a suboptimal system.
All right.
I did quantify a little bit in an early version of our model that idea actually of just dumping the power to the grid for free and not paying anything. And it's, you know, it's there. That option is going to be better than this grid participation charge.
Yeah, I mean, when the backfeed rate gets so low, are you better off throwing some kilowatt hours away rather than paying $50 a month for the privilege of getting 3 cents a piece for it?
There's a lot of utility scale solar that gets curtailed and throws it away. But this still actually goes to somebody. It goes to the grid.
So real quick, Jim, one thing that's sort of gotten missed in this conversation is basing the export rates on avoided costs after some averaging does encourage export in the evening, which is another storage encourager. So the avoided costs in the evening are 4 times or more as high as avoided costs in the middle of the day. And they get especially high during summer evenings when we've had our reliability challenges.
But if you had a time of use rate that really said, okay, when we really need the power is 7 p.m. to 8 p.m. in August and September, or maybe even all 4 months of the summer, and you set that rate at 50 cents a kilowatt hour, people would install batteries and they wouldn't export. Well, maybe they might occasionally, but they would size the battery to avoid the retail rate.
Would you have that for everybody or just for storage customers?
I mean, it could be for everybody. It's the rate that it provides the incentive for a person to add storage. So if I'm having to pay to import at 8 o'clock at night at 50 cents a kilowatt hour, I'm going to seriously think about
right.
storage.
And that runs into a problem with lower income customers, right? And that's the issue. And
Right.
people who just can't change their lifestyle. So that's where like I played around with TOU rates, got data from the general rate cases, and it was just really hard. And trust me, I spent lots of nights trying to do that, to come up with a TOU rate that's anywhere close to having something like a 10-year payback and minimizing rate impact on the rest of the customers. Just the volumetric charges and different components are so high, it just mathematically just wouldn't work out.
Customers would be treated differently. They'd be on a carer or fairer rate, so they would not be.
And
yeah, you'd have to differentiate between
Right.
customers who can afford to invest in a battery and those who can't.
And then, you'd be drawing boundaries, and there'd be people who left off. There are people who are renters or something who couldn't get it. It's just, my point being, there is no perfect solution here to this other than some broader rate reform, which, hopefully we'll get to in the next few years in California.
But there's a better solution, not a perfect solution, but a better solution.
Man, I did this calculation in the Hawaii docket that hasn't been decided yet, even though we did all the work a year and a half ago. Work is not a Polynesian tradition, and it hasn't caught on in a big way there. Getting things done has just never been part of the plan. But I calculated that if a average residential customer was subscribed to the company's existing time of use rate, with the lowest price in the middle of the day and the highest price in the evening, and use power with the typical load shape of a typical residential customer, they would wind up paying $77 a month if they netted to 0 kilowatt hours. A substantial contribution. I think it offers some credence to the point that Myron made, that if you concentrate fixed cost recovery into primarily into the stress hours, you actually can recover system costs and give all customers, including solar customers, the opportunity to avoid consumption and stress hours and avoid paying that concentration of system costs. And Mohit, you said you looked at different volumetric rates and you didn't get there. I think the problem there is probably mostly the California's revenue requirement is too high.
So Jim, let me just give you an example of who's getting it right. Sacramento Municipal Utility District. They went through the exact same process. They proposed a grid access charge that was draconian, and then they listened to their customers, they listened to the solar community, and they came back They eliminated the grid access charge, and they put in together a suite of policies, including critical peak pricing, including an incentive for virtual power plants, including incentives for batteries, and a higher differentiated charge. And it's going to work for SMUD. SMUD has about the same amount of penetration of solar as do the investor-owned utilities. PG&E probably a little bit more.
Good.
So there is a way of doing this.
Real quick, the reason why SMUD was able to do it, firstly, they wanted to come up with a more revenue neutral rate tariff, and they got lots of public criticism, and they backed out of it, right? That doesn't mean that, it's like a revenue neutral thing to do. Secondly, their volumetric charges are half or less than half of the IOUs. So they could live with not having a grid participation charge and that portion of the rate impact not being much. You're looking at 12 cents a kilowatt hour versus 25 to 30 and higher, right? And that's a big reason why they were able to swallow that pill. So I agree with you. We need to come up with ways to make everything work. And the really hard point here is what's the right balance between all these different things?
But SMUD's lower overall rates are not a result of solar. It's a result of a lot of other things that SMUD's doing right.
But they're designing this policy layered onto existing state of rates. And their existing state of rates is very different than the IOUs.
Well, their revenue requirements is quite a bit less.
And that too. So I think we need to, as a community, really work hard to shrink the revenue requirement pie that the IOUs have, firstly, and then get better at allocating that revenue requirement pie. And we need to do both. But in the meantime, I don't want to let imperfections there stop any progress here. One of the things I've experienced here, and I'm new to this, is you can approach this in many different ways. And I feel a lot of us approach this in how can we sort of keep net metering and rooftop solar going as opposed to what's best for our clean energy goal and rates at large. And I'm hoping we can do a larger rate reform that gets at all of that.
Yeah, SMUD listens to the solar community. I'm afraid that the commissioners have not yet heard the solar community. This is going to put people out of business. It's going to push the bigger companies like Sunrun and others out of the state. It's going to have a really drastic impact on the industry. And then you expect someone to come in and be the installer for low-income customers. It's just not going to work to say, we're going to have to reinvent a brand new industry that will just serve low-income customers. You need to have a healthy industry in the state and then force them to change their business models to be more directed to serving the lower income and customers in disadvantaged communities. But if you destroy the industry, you're not going to have a transition that's going to work for the other customers.
All right. I think I'm going to cut it off there. We're at the top of the hour. It's been an energetic interchange. Everybody's being civil. That's the goal of the Electricity Brain Trust, not to reach conclusions, but to engage. And I'm going to stop the recording now. I'm going to leave the channel open for another 10 or 15 minutes if people want to stick around and have a completely informal discussion.